Hello and welcome to the latest stream tonight, starting a little early for the specific reason that I wanted to just spend the first few minutes saying a little more about the events in France and where things may well be going. Now, what I wanted to respond to was a question that I got on Twitter from Tonkinese Cat Fancier. If you're out there, hello. And the question goes as follows. Can this kind of urban underclass even be considered working class, though? I don't blame them for doing what they're doing, but unless Marx put this kind of explosion... But doesn't Marx put this kind of explosion that doesn't have any demands beyond much hope of acting in a politically powerful way? So, as I said last night, what you find with the explosions like this, upsurges in violence against the state and the state forces, again, it's the same as we got here over a decade ago now, 12 years ago in 2011. Yes, it is a example as to how quickly the state forces can be chased away, but it's also an example of what happens when, if it's not the lumpen proletariat who are engaging and leading the violence, then it's very much a lumpenized ideology which is dominating. And what that does, really, in practical terms, is that it takes this moment which starts off in something of a positive way, which is that it chases away the forces of the state, but it rapidly becomes simply nihilistic. And again, this happened 12 years ago in Britain. It happened nearly 20 years ago in the violence in the suburbs of Paris, and it's happening again now. Without the proletariat taking the leading role, without the guiding role, the leading role of the vanguard party, the Communist Party, and without discipline and organization, all of which the lumpen proletariat is not capable of, you get the collapse into simply violence and madness and nihilism, with just endless buildings being burnt down, endless property destruction inside the communities where this came from. Now, as to who's doing that, these are open questions, because we all know very well that the police and these intelligence agencies employ an awful lot of provocateurs inside these crowds when they start being active. So as to who's doing that, again, open question. But the fact is that what ends up happening when the lumpen or lumpenized crowds dominate these things is that the working class itself, even though they might hate the police, which of course many of the French working class do hate the police, they also shrink back from, ultimately, the kind of chaotic disorder that you see going on. And what ultimately happens is that the state is able to reassert control, as I think that they will do eventually. Macron will, having failed to respond initially, he'll now give the military and the cops every single thing they could possibly want in order to crush this thing, and they will do in the end. And ultimately, they will be backed by all of the French petty bourgeoisie, the French ruling class, of course, and the working class will play no role, or a very little role. And this is the big reason why, of course, Marx said as early as 1847 to 48, when he was writing the Communist Manifesto, that the role of the lumpen in any upsurge has to be one where they are swept along behind the movement of the proletariat. The lumpen, when they move into action on their own, end up just doing things like this, because this isn't new. You know, lumpenized rioting is as old as capitalism. And what it generally does is, because it has no direction, because all it ends up doing is destroying things and looting things, because the class force that ultimately is behind it is the lumpen or lumpenized elements of the working class, again, it goes nowhere. It doesn't have a broader appeal. It has no organization. It has no demands. And so eventually the state will just wrap it up, throw these people back into the suburbs they came from, arrest loads of them, throw them in prison, brutalize a lot of people, and then we're back to square one. It also enables the state, and you can see this happening already. The French bourgeois ideologists will be using this as a means to try and further divide the working class by whipping up loads of racialism, which is what they'll try and do with this. So ultimately, because this has no organization, behind it, it has minimal, if any, links with any wider working class struggle, and it is a movement principally of the lumpenized elements of the working class and just straight up lumpen proletarians, then unfortunately it will peter out and crash into the ground. And that is the unfortunate truth. And don't believe me, go and check into the history. How did the riots of 2005, 6, 7 in France help with struggles against Chirac and Sarkozy? Well, it didn't. And as my comrade from the Class Consciousness Project says, 2011 working class people were calling for the army to be brought in. And not just white working class people either. I can remember very well the number of Turkish people and people from North Africa in Manchester who were, many of whom were more in the sort of lower end petty bourgeois, but by no means rich, who were like guarding their communities with iron bars, like gangs of guys stood around waiting to confront lumpen rioters. This doesn't help. With mobilizing the working class, this kind of thing, though it does expose the weakness of the state initially, rapidly turns into its opposite, which is that it becomes a rallying point for reaction, and the working class turns against it quite quickly. Even though they might have no liking for the cops or the government whatsoever, people don't want to live in an atmosphere of insecurity and violence. It's also why the various characters within the state machine are more than happy sometimes to see riots like this when they think it will damage opposition to them. Bear in mind, the big opposition to Macron until this was the sort of semi-organized movements of the yellow vests and then the movement of the organized working class. In my opinion, even though this looks more dramatic, it's actually less dangerous for Macron in terms of a challenge to him and the authority of the French state. A state can survive a directionless, very violent series of riots. Macron may be fucked politically. He may now be replaced by Le Pen at some point. He's a lame duck for the rest of his term. But now the French state, what it will do is it will dress up its further enhancing of the powers of the police and the powers of the military to intervene in French civilian affairs. And ultimately, what it prepares the ground for is an even more repressive regime to follow, which, even though it will be sold to elements of the working class as well, this is to crack down on the lumpens, what the French state really needs isn't to crack down on the lumpens, it needs to keep them in their place. It's to destroy the bargaining power of the French working class and to destroy the mobilizational powers of the French working class, even more than they've been destroyed already, which is ultimately what Marine Le Pen's job will be. But she'll be able to dress it up now as taking action against recalcitrant elements. They'll use all kinds of racialism to try and divide the working class. They'll use the images of all these riots to try and sell their policies. And this is the danger of where this directionless stuff goes. It ultimately ends up aiding reaction. Whereas, as my comrades in the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists, put it in a tweet earlier today, a revolution is the upturning of the relations of society. It's a festival of revolt. It's the overturning of the relations of production in the factory, in the office, in so many spheres of life. It's the upturning of the power of the state. It's the stepping forward of the working class into a position of power. This isn't any of that. This isn't any of that now. This is just a violent confrontation between lumpenized elements and the forces of the state, which the forces of the state will ultimately win. And this is how it goes. Okay, we've got more questions. Chris Luno asks, wasn't the USSR revolution funded by Wall Street bankers? No, it wasn't. That's a myth that was come up with later on by Russian reactionaries to justify why they'd lost. The Wall Street bankers spent millions and millions of pounds trying to defeat the revolution. And the Americans sent a force to intervene against it to try and destroy it. They occupied a significant part of Eastern Russia for a while. The American forces did. That's a pretty funny thing to do if you've invested in it. Slava says, yes, working class people don't like to see burning cars and looting of the stores. That's very correct. Jerry says, it's quite a tragedy when a well-organized revolution is so needed. Yes, it's another missed opportunity. Chris says, let's be realistic here. There will be a communist revolution in the West. Chris, we've had this discussion before, and you know I disagree with you. They're not people aren't aspirational from birth. You learn to be consumerist later on in life. You learn to desire things, and things that really you don't need. And as to private property rights, well, what do you mean by private property rights? Do you mean the right to own a car or a television or a house? Well, communists don't contest any of that. Do you mean owning a business with the right to exploit large numbers of other people? Well, we do contest that. So I think you need to clarify what you actually mean there, because going all the way back to Karl Marx, Marx himself said we don't contest the individual's right to own goods. And in the USSR, one of the key objectives was to get people into better accommodation with better furniture, better facilities of life. So never contested people's wish to live better. In fact, that's one of the big purposes of communism, is to enable people to live better. So I dispute the foundation of your question there, Chris. So yes, the whole thing in France is a tragedy compounded on a couple of other tragedies, because you got all this energy and all this anger pouring out, and ultimately it's going nowhere. In Britain, we're obsessed with home ownership. Yes, to a degree, but again, home ownership's largely a delusion. I know loads of people who've got locked into very expensive mortgages. They don't own their homes, and many of them never will. I mean, it took my parents' generation 25 odd years to pay off their mortgage. Now, like people my age, they can't even get a mortgage that you could pay off over the course of 25 years anymore. You get a huge amount of debt which you can't get rid of. So you don't own a house. You're told that you do, but the bank owns the house ultimately, because it can be taken away from you, just like all those people who got foreclosed on in the United States and in Britain to a degree after 2008. So what we've been sold is a series of illusions about what we can own, about what it brings us. So yes, the energy for revolution is clearly there in France. I mean, the Yellow Vest movement proved a huge desire was there for something different. The revolt over pension changes clearly proved that the same thing was going on with regard to that, or a similar mood was there. And when you've got like people joining these riots, some of them are joining it for the reason that they want to go and, fight the police, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes some people just like that. And all these things point to a profound need in a society for socialism, for a revolution, because it cannot continue in the same way. If we continue in the same way, what is going to happen? What is going to happen is more and more debt will be loaded onto individuals, more and more people will be reduced to lumpen status, and as the quote from Stalin goes, more and more people will be left eking out an existence on the boundaries of capitalism. And those won't be, people who recently arrived from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Those will be people who want to claim indigeneity, want to claim that the fact that their parents, grandparents and great-grandparents were here somehow gets them something. It doesn't. And again, what we're about to see in France and elsewhere is that the French state and other states is about to do a pivot into hardcore racialism. All this woke stuff, which has never really been as strong in France as it has been in the Anglo-Saxon world, is going to go away, and they're going to need to try and divide the working class even more. And how they're going to do that, they're going to lean harder into racialism. I am from the home counties and the middle class and will always side with the capitalist class. They are happy for the north to rot. Sad but true. Actually, you're wrong there as well, Chris. They're happy for large elements of the south to rot too. If you took a stroll out from the home counties, you can go around many areas in the southeast. It's not just about the north of England. It's about large areas of London, particularly South London, There's areas on the south coast, like places like Dover, all of which are being left to rot. In fact, the capitalist class will leave everywhere to rot, ultimately, as long as they can keep moving the money around the world and taking and clipping the coupons. That's just the way it goes. And if you think that your area is going to be immune from that, how do you think it's going to be when the rest of the country does get left to rot, mate? What do you think is going to be left for you? Not a lot. Not a lot. Because they'll throw you under the bus as well when the time comes. So, with that in mind, what I'll do is I will move now to just sort out a couple of technical details. Just bear with me a moment. Okay. Right, I've just binned that Chris guy because, quite frankly, if you're going to come on here and say that you're siding with the capitalist class, when I've been so nice to you, basically I'm going to tell you ultimately to fuck off, essentially. So that is about the limit of what I will take, to be quite blunt. So good evening to Paul Charo. Good evening to Kai S from New England. Hello and welcome along. So, welcome to the Stalin Hour. Very appropriate. So, what I'm going to be doing is going through the 1907 work, Anarchism or Socialism by the great comrade Stalin. And I'll be using the version of this book which you can find from Iskra Press. Recent republishing of Volume 1 of the Collected Works of Stalin, because the Collected Works of Stalin were out of print for a very, very long time, because they were, of course, printed up to the middle 1950s in the Soviet Union, but they, of course, stopped printing them after the so-called secret speech of Khrushchev. Even though they did continue printing them within the People's Republic of China. I don't know if they still do print them within the PRC, but recently there was a very interesting intervention from a Chinese academic who said that the big mistake of the Soviet Union was to attack the legacy of Stalin, and that the legacy of Stalin was an area of political struggle which had direct relevance upon the policies and the actions of communist parties in today's world. So, very interesting comment from a Chinese academic there. So, getting started with Anarchism or Socialism, and for a bit of background, Anarchism or Socialism comes from, again, 1907, and it's a book that was initially published as a series of articles in the Georgian Bolshevik newspaper, or more to the point, RSDLP newspaper. And this was a very brief daily paper that was established legally in Tbilisi after the 1905 revolution, when the Tsardom relaxed the censorship. And they relaxed this for about a week, which is a great indication of the liberal reforms of the Tsardom. So this is from the paper. I'm just going to read this out. Chevny Sekhovreba, Our Life, which ran legally from February 18th, 1907 to March 6th, 1907. So there was an awful lot of scope for free expression there in Georgia in 1907. All of about 3 weeks, it seems. So in that time, Stalin engaged with a controversy with a group of anarchists, and it was from that controversy that Anarchism or Socialism took shape. And this is became a big important part of the early works of Stalin. And I should say, if you've read this, that of course one of the things that we're told constantly, and I was told constantly when I was in a Trotskyite organization, that, oh, Stalin writes so badly, he's a very unintelligent man, he's barely readable. The complete opposite is true. He actually writes very well. Perhaps not quite as well as Lenin, but certainly he writes as well as Trotsky and with much greater clarity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be going through this, picking out some quotes, reading through them and discussing them. Generally what the theme is, of course, is that Stalin is defending Marxism from the attacks of anarchism and the Georgian anarchists, who were quite big at the time. And so he's going through dialectical materialism and Marxist socialism, and he's defending the key points of it. And from that we can glean a lot when he goes through these concepts and explains them. Now I'll start with a quote from the introduction to this work, because I think that this is very interesting. And so yeah, hello to various people who've come in: President Jesus, Roddy Keenan, and Peter. Yeah, I was in the pub with Chris debating, but none of us trying to get through a podcast. Yeah, look, I put up with that guy for like 5 days in a row, just saying the same thing over and over again. The reason why I booted him wasn't that he was disagreeing with me. He'd been disagreeing with me for 5 days. The reason why I booted him was because he kept saying the same thing over and over again. And then he basically comes in and says, fuck the working class. So if you say that, I'm going to boot you. And he can, if he really wants to cry about it, he can write a letter to the Daily Mail. So reading the first excerpt from this, which is from the introduction, and I will read a couple of excerpts from this. So, first one reads as follows. Some people believe that Marxism and anarchism are based on the same principles and that the disagreements between them concern only tactics, so that in the opinion of these people it is quite impossible to draw a contrast between these two trends. This is a great mistake. We believe that the anarchists are real enemies of Marxism. Accordingly, we also hold that a real struggle must be waged against real enemies. Therefore, it is necessary to examine the doctrine of the anarchists from beginning to end and to weigh it up thoroughly from all aspects. Now, this is, of course, a crucial distinction that needs to be made. A lot of people who don't have any real knowledge about the subject will tell you that, oh, well, you know, why are the anarchists, why are the anarchists and the Marxists fighting? Surely they all come from the same place. They all believe in the same thing. As Stalin points out, and as actually some of the more honest anarchists will say, the starting point of anarchism is the individual, the sacred sovereign individual. Sounds a bit like Ayn Rand already, doesn't it? And if you read the works of people like William Godwin, the very early English anarchist, and others of that nature, especially the American 19th century anarchists, who people like Lysander Spooner, who were very much drawn towards isolationism, towards an exaggerated extension of the American ideal, that they were going to go out and find a patch of land somewhere and live away from the intruding powers of the always expanding American federal government. And if that sounds familiar, Ron Paul's on live right now talking about the same thing. So anarchism, even though it became something of a working class movement through anarcho-syndicalism, still had as its starting point the idea of the individual, whereas Marxism, as Stalin says here, has the idea that the individual only becomes free through the collective struggle of the masses, through the collective struggle of the working class. Only when the working class becomes freed of exploitation does the individual become free. And anarchism, even in its more trade union-based versions, still thinks that the sovereign individual is the starting point for everything. And that is not how Marxism takes it. The relationship between the individual and the masses is much more dialectical than anarchists will allow for. So moving on, and this is where Stalin adds some more to that. The point is that Marxism and anarchism are built up on entirely different principles. In spite of the fact that both come into the arena of the struggle under the flag of socialism, the cornerstone of anarchism is the individual, whose emancipation, according to its tenets, is the principal condition for the emancipation of the masses, the collective body. According to the tenets of anarchism, the emancipation of the masses is impossible until the individual is emancipated. Accordingly, its slogan is everything for the individual. The cornerstone of Marxism, however, is the masses whose emancipation, according to its tenets, is the principal condition for the emancipation of the individual. That is to say, according to the tenets of Marxism, the emancipation of the individual is impossible until the masses are emancipated. Accordingly, its slogan is everything for the masses. So Stalin clarifying the key and crucial difference, or one of the crucial differences between anarchism and, at the time they said socialism, now you would say Marxism or communism. So this is also why an awful lot of anarchists in the post-World War II period ended up basically siding with American imperialism quite a lot of the time, because they fundamentally agree with the bourgeois ideology of the sacredness of the individual. And they don't see, or many of them don't see, the fact that the individual and his place within the hierarchy of society, his place within different classes of society, very much impacts heavily upon, like, well, what is the status of the individual? A free individual under capitalism is a capitalist. The capitalist is, of course, far more free than any worker is, or even any petit bourgeois is. Whereas the worker, of course, though he might have many freedoms on paper under capitalism, he is not free to exercise those. So the old example always is that theoretically somebody who lives in a council flat in South Manchester can go and demand a meal at the Ritz-Carlton or the Ivy or something, and he's free to go in there and order something. They might sneer at him, but he's not free in reality to be able to do that, or to do all kinds of other things that you're supposed to be able to do. He's not free to have his opinion heard, because to actually have your opinion heard on a mass basis takes an awful lot of capital. To be able to influence the political life of his nation takes an awful lot of capital. And to just be able to get through life without major upsets whenever you run into difficulty takes an awful lot of capital. So you can see where if you don't have that capital, then under capitalism you are not a free individual. So a lot of anarchists who say, well, it's all about the free individual. Well, where does the individual sit within the network of classes? If he's a capitalist, he's free already. If we're really seriously going to say that the capitalists are an oppressed class because they're stuck in a state structure, well, I'm sure Elon Musk would agree. So, moving on then, Stalin, having started off like that, then moves into a consideration of the different aspects of Marxian socialism that he's looking to defend from the attacks of the anarchists. So, he starts off by examining, in the first part here, the dialectical method. And so, I will read from the first section of this to demonstrate the point that he's making. It is said that social life is in continual motion and development, and that is true. Life must not be regarded as something immutable and static. It never remains at one level. It is in eternal motion, in an eternal process of destruction and creation. Therefore, life always continues the new and the old, the growing and the dying, the revolutionary and the counter-revolutionary. Now, this is a point that Stalin's going to elaborate on at great length in this work. It is the essence of the point that he is making with regard to the dialectical method. And you can see that he takes this from Engels in his work Anti-Düring, and also Engels' work on dialectics and science, which is that life itself is dialectical. It's in a process of, all of us, every living thing in the world, is in a process of constantly coming into being and fading away again. And this isn't just a case of like the span of life. It is very much a case down to a cellular level in the body, with everything constantly having to renew itself. And that's true of every living thing. And every force that powers our world is in this constant process of coming into being and fading away. And the revolutionary and the counter-revolutionary are in this process as well. The capitalist system, when you break it down and look at it, is constantly in the process of creating and dying, creating more and dying, and reaching the point under capitalism where it creates so much that it has to exterminate value or liquidate value, to go back to my favorite Andrew Mellon quote. So he's setting out the terms of what his argument is there, and one of the crucial discoveries that Marx and Engels uncover in the dialectical method. Now, moving on from there, he goes on to make the point about the power of the proletariat and why the proletariat is the only truly revolutionary class in capitalist societies. So he talks about why in the 19th century, the Russian sort of revolutionary intelligentsia, known as the Narodniks, were convinced that the revolutionary power in society was not going to be the proletariat, it was going to be the lower end petty bourgeoisie. Because in the view of the Narodniks, the petty bourgeoisie, especially in the countryside, the very small property owners, were going to be the basis of a revolt against the landlords and against the capitalists. But the early Russian Marxist, and Stalin following on from them, argues very much the opposite. Now, I'll just read a quick selection from the book to illustrate what the point that Stalin is arguing here. Now, to this point, the Marxist replied, "It is true that the rural and urban petty bourgeoisie now constitute the majority and are really poor. But is that the point? The petty bourgeoisie has long constituted the majority, but up to now it has displayed no initiative in the struggle for freedom without the assistance of the proletariat. Why? Because the petty bourgeoisie as a class is not growing. On the contrary, it is disintegrating day by day, breaking up into bourgeois and proletarians. On the other hand, nor is poverty of decisive importance here. Of course, tramps are poorer than the petty bourgeoisie, but nobody will say that they can undertake the task of emancipating Russia." So, what he's arguing here, and I'll just to give a little bit of historical context as well, when he says that the petty bourgeoisie constitutes the majority, what he's talking about is the fact that there is a large and significant number of peasants in pre-revolutionary Russia in the late 19th and early 20th century who did receive some land when the serfs were emancipated. This is actually the story of Trotsky's family, who were landowners in Ukraine. They received some land, and Trotsky's father successfully invested in that land and got to the point where they were able to exploit not only the land, but a large amount of peasant labor with it. So there were a significant amount of petty bourgeois peasants, but most of them were scratching out a living on a very small portion of land. Agriculture was horrendously inefficient, and they were very, very poor. And often the land that they'd managed to attain got snapped up by a bigger landowner, like Trotsky's father. And the urban petty bourgeois, as Stalin says correctly, were constantly on a very precarious basis. You can see this in works by Russian authors from the sort of mid to late 19th century. You can see this in Dostoevsky, when he's talking in Crime and Punishment about the whole purpose of that. He's obviously dealing with the guilt of a murderer, but the petty bourgeois student Raskolnikov is meant to be this man of education, but he's living on like crusts of bread. He's not able to pay his rent. He's this intelligent and educated young man, but he can barely survive, even though he's meant to be one of the privileged layers of this growing petty bourgeois in Russian society. So you can also see it in the classic work Brothers Karamazov, where Dostoevsky is examining the manners of the petty bourgeoisie and the various different aspects of the changing Russian class structure. Dostoevsky, as Stalin once observed, was a political reactionary but a great psychologist. He's examining, of course, the what he calls the oafism, the oafishness of old man Karamazov, and he's examining through the medium of the characters of the brothers Karamazov, as played, by the way, in a 1950s film by people like Yul Brynner and William Shatner. Not an adaptation that many people have seen. But the characters of the brothers are there from Dostoevsky to examine all these different aspects of what Dostoevsky regarded as like the Russian soul. So you have one who's a ultra-religious type, and you have another one who's this guy who's very much looking towards the West, who's very much obsessed with aping the manners of the revolutionary country that was at the time France. Fascinating book. Be sure to read it if you haven't. It's very much in line with what Stalin's talking about here in regard to the Russian class structure. Question from John Paul Jones: do we need a bourgeois revolution in the UK before a communist one? We've had one. We had the first bourgeois revolution back in the 17th century, John. I'm not surprised that many people aren't familiar with it because it's not taught that way. If you want to know more about it, be sure to pick up a book called Century of Revolution by a historian called Christopher Hill. It goes through the entire 17th century, talking about how the bourgeois revolution in Britain was achieved. And it's interesting, again, that the bourgeois don't really like to talk about it, because if you studied the 16th and 17th century, you'd see, and into the 18th century, you see that capitalism in Britain was not established without an awful lot of war, revolution, counter-revolution, and a hell of a lot of violence and death. So again, they don't like to talk about it anymore. They still don't know how to handle the historical legacy of Oliver Cromwell, the greatest English bourgeois revolutionary. And he's got like a couple of statues in this country, one by Parliament. You're generally not taught a great deal about him at school, even though without him there would be no modern British state. But Century of Revolution, my book recommendation, along with, of course, Stalin. So, moving on then back to the quote, where he says that the decisive factor for the proletariat isn't just poverty, because there's an awful lot of declassed elements and homeless people in late 19th and early 20th century Russia. And so it's not just numbers, it's the role of the proletariat in the production process, the proletariat being brought together in such a revolutionary way by the capitalist class, the role that they play in production, the fact that they are able to fundamentally disrupt production by going on strike, by walking out, by staging all kinds of actions. That is why the proletariat is a revolutionary class. It's its role in production. It's its role as the creator of profit, as the creator of wealth, that gives it its revolutionary role. And that it's called into existence by the capitalists, of course, explains why capitalists are so conflicted about this, what the capitalists regard as this monster they've created. On the one hand, the labour of the proletariat is making the capitalists all this capital, all this profit. On the other hand, and again, Marx is great with this when he goes into the attitude of the capitalists towards the working class in the 19th and then back into the 18th century. The working class has always been feared and hated and despised by the ruling class, by the capitalists, because they look at these great gigantic cities like the one I'm sat in now in Manchester. If you're in America, you're probably sat in one of the giant industrial cities of the 19th or early 20th centuries. They look at this huge mass of humanity that they have brought together to work in the mills and in the steel industry and shipbuilding and mining. And they look at it and they see, beyond all the profit that they're making, they only see a huge mass of humanity that could easily destroy all their profit making within a few minutes if the mood took them. And so, of course, that contradiction, that on the one hand needing this class to profit from, and on the other hand hating and fearing the working class, is a constant struggle within the bourgeois intelligentsia, within bourgeois academia. And that's always been the case. Going all the way back to the 18th and early 19th century, you find all kinds of literature from capitalists talking about how much they hate the working class, how the working class is just this source of disease, this source of disorder, this source of sinfulness. And it's what animates the theories of people like Malthus. Malthus, the English parson, the Church of England clergyman, who hated large elements of humanity itself. But that all comes from the contradictions that the existence of the working class brings about inside the mind of the capitalist, needing them and hating them at the same time. So Stalin then goes on to talk about how the dialectical method views or allows us to interpret changes in society. And he talks about how different political traditions and analyse and interpret change, how how idealists see change often as erupting out of the ground as coming from nowhere, or in the case of the more religious Christian types of Europe and Russia at the time, as an outburst of evil, which is what the Christian fanatics in Russia still describe the Russian Revolution as. And Stalin, of course, as a Marxist, contests that. And he points out in the book that the dialectical method can actually guide you to properly understand why political and social outbursts do happen. And so he has this great line where he says, movement is evolutionary. When the progressive elements spontaneously continue their daily activities and introduce minor quantitative changes into the old order. Movement is revolutionary when the same elements combine, become imbued with a single idea, and sweep down upon the enemy camp with the object of uprooting the old order and of introducing qualitative changes in life and of establishing a new order. Evolution prepares for revolution and creates the ground for it. Revolution consummates the process of evolution and facilitates its further activity. So what he's talking about there is that there are evolutionary periods in history where these quantitative changes take place under the surface, often unseen, where you would not imagine that a revolution is about to burst forth. And then you go and suddenly you see when, say, for instance, in Paris in 1789 or Petrograd in 1917, or China in the 1940s up to 1949, though that was a rather longer revolutionary process, but that suddenly revolutionary change bursts out and it appears to come from nowhere. But Stalin's point here is that you actually investigate this and you can see the quantitative changes taking place below the surface of society for many, many years until eventually these build up and build up and build up until they burst forth and become a qualitative change, a change in the mode of production, one class stepping forward and removing from power another class. Or we can go back earlier to draw on the question we had a moment ago about a bourgeois revolution. The bourgeois revolution in Britain is proof of this concept, because what you had was a series of quantitative changes taking place in Britain, largely in England and Scotland. The case of Ireland is different, as I will frequently refer to when talking about Scottish nationalism. But if we look at the case of England and Scotland, you can see throughout the 16th century and even earlier into the 15th century, going back to the time really of the Wars of the Roses, you start to see all these changes taking place in like British land ownership. You see when at the end of the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII starts introducing changes into how much land you can own and how many armed men you can keep. Basically removing the rights of the feudal lords to keep private armies, because they'd just been through a decade plus long civil war that was caused partly by the fact that the feudal state was too weak to impose its will. And so you get a slow move towards absolutism, which is consolidated by his son, Henry VIII, who gets rid of other challenges to his rule by getting rid of the Catholic Church, or in reality rebranding the Catholic Church as the Church of England and making himself the head of it. Henry VIII never stopped being a Catholic, by the way. Apparently he died clutching his rosary and begging in Latin for forgiveness, so make of that what you will. But the fact is that the link with Rome was broken, and of course the treasuries of the churches in England and Scotland and Wales were broken open, and the land was confiscated and redistributed to many new families coming from the growing small bourgeois, the early petty bourgeois, who buy this land from the state, thus filling the state's coffers, and of course introducing a new layer onto the land who were much more informed by early capitalism than they were by feudalism. These quantitative changes carry on all the way through the 16th century till by the time you get to the 17th century, what do you have? You have the power of the state solidified in the form of an absolutist monarch, and you have the landlords, the feudal landed gentry. The power of them has been drained away because the more efficient estates are now being worked by people who bought the land or who are working the land on behalf of the aristocracy in a more efficient fashion, informed by new production techniques and new techniques of farming the land. You have a growing bourgeois in the city of London who are making money from the position of London as an international trading centre. But you have this absolutism, which is still claiming the rights of feudalism to govern the kingdom. And so eventually all of these quantitative changes that take place over centuries suddenly hit the point where they can no longer be contained, where the mode of governing, the rule of James I and Charles I, Charles I is the king who ultimately loses his head here, in the 1640s, comes to a crunching end due to a confrontation with the Parliament, which is filled with the new representatives of the rising English bourgeoisie. And suddenly the powers of the absolutist state are not tolerable to the bourgeois anymore, particularly the king's frequent infringement on property rights. So again, all the changes that take place over centuries, all these quantitative changes, burst forth into a qualitative change in the 1640s when the English bourgeois says to the king, we will no longer accept your rights to interfere with our property. We no longer accept your rights to imprison us without trial and without legal representation. We no longer accept your rights to declare state monopolies. We no longer accept your right to levy taxes without consultation with our representatives. And the bursting forth into qualitative change comes, of course, in the Civil War and the Revolution. But you can trace the development of all these quantitative changes taking place, some of which were dramatic, some of which much less so, finally breaking out into the open in the 1640s. And you can do the same process of tracing all the quantitative changes in France, which eventually burst forth in 1789. And so it's by studying these revolutions, you can see proof of the Marxist method that Stalin is talking about here. So far, he's defending the Marxist method as a mode of analysis from the questioning of the anarchists. And the anarchists at the time in Georgia were popular in the petty bourgeoisie and the student community, which just goes to show that nothing ever really changes. So one of the ways in which the anarchists at the time chose to try and attack the Marxists in Georgia and wider Russia was to say that the Marxist method was drawn from Hegel, and Hegel was a reactionary, and therefore the Marxist method is invalid. And here Stalin does a great piece of analysis where he explains why the Hegelian method, the Hegelian dialectic, is so revolutionary, even though Hegel's politics were that of a Prussian conservative. And this is a great meditation also on the role of the individual in history. So the way in which Stalin talks about this is he starts off talking about how many different figures in the fields of science are basically conservative, politically speaking, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should discard their discoveries because, well, why would you discard the discoveries of, Stalin says, Pascal and Leibniz or Lamarck and Darwin, and Hegel should be treated in the same way. Now, bear in mind, in the 18th and 19th centuries, philosophy was often treated as a science alongside the hard sciences. And you can see this in a book like, for instance, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where in the early parts of that book, the Baron Frankenstein is, of course, Dr. Frankenstein is talking about how he's going to do the philosophical sciences along with these the natural sciences. So he's give us an example of how the philosophy was viewed as running alongside things like biology, chemistry, and physics as equally scientific, which is where, or partly where, Marx and Engels get the term scientific socialism from, because they were men of that period and they saw political economy and philosophy as being as scientific, every bit as scientific as what are referred to as the hard sciences. So first of all, Stalin says, well, you wouldn't discard the discoveries of these scientists just because they were conservative, politically speaking, and also he regards Hegel in the same way, as basically adding to the philosophical science. And so he disputes with the anarchists about why we should throw out the contribution of someone like Hegel, who isn't on the same page politically. And he, of course, rightly states that the Hegelian philosophical system is revolutionary, and he goes on to talk about why. So I'll just read a quote here from the work itself. Needless to say, Hegel's philosophical system, which rests on the immutable idea, is from beginning to end metaphysical. But it is also clear that Hegel's dialectical method, which repudiates all immutable ideas, is from beginning to end scientific and revolutionary. That is why Karl Marx, who subjected Hegel's metaphysical system to devastating criticism, at the same time praised his dialectical method, which, as Marx says, lets nothing impose upon it and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. So Hegel, if you've ever read him, not an easy read by any means. I won't go into great detail about him now, but the essence of his dialectical method is found in, well, quite a number of his books. The one I've read most recently is his Logic, where there is a passage there which goes into this dialectical method that Stalin is talking about there, about how nothing is immutable, all things come into being and pass away, and how that basically completely undercuts Hegel's political conservatism, which it's true, it does. Once you read that, you can't really understand how Hegel could be a Prussian conservative type. But of course, he was a fairly well-off teacher for a Berlin State University, so it's a case of the material deciding the consciousness there. But the revolutionary element in his philosophy is undoubtedly that discovery that there are no fixed and immutable points, and that everything is subject to constant change. And it is that which, of course, Marx and Engels extract from Hegel's philosophy, thus making it this what is referred to as Marx standing Hegel on his head, because you get this idealist dialectical method, and then, or you could say that Marx stood it the right way up, because Marx then, of course, imbues it with materialism, which he takes from people like Ludwig Feuerbach to create the Marxist system of dialectical materialism. So Stalin disputes with the anarchists about why you should be able to take things from Hegel. And of course, the anarchists back then, you can see if you read the book that Stalin quotes extensively from the anarchist newspapers, they're actually not all that much different from like ultra-leftists today. Ultra-leftists who argue that, well, you shouldn't read this because it's reactionary, you shouldn't watch this film, you shouldn't read that book. And these are all people who've got like, Maoist, he, him, she, they on their Twitter profiles. But, people like Stalin, Mao, Lenin would laugh at these people because, as Stalin says, the very system, the Marxist system, is built upon the contribution of people who came before Marx who were all politically reactionary. But just because somebody is politically reactionary doesn't necessarily mean that there's not revolutionary elements to their philosophy or their thinking. And Stalin was contesting with anarchists who were arguing in exactly the same way as like your average teenage Maoist does now. And this was written in 1906 to 07. So, moving on then, as to the impact that the dialectical method has, and what this means in terms of the politics and the way in which the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party was operating at the time. So, key example here is that Stalin talks about how the demand made by the Bolshevik section of the party at the time, it was also made by the Mensheviks. The demand of the party prior to 1905 had been for a democratic republic. Now, after the split in 1903 between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, the two parties, or two wings of the party, were both demanding a democratic republic, but they were also very much starting to differ about what that meant. Now, Stalin, who was, of course, a key part of the Bolshevik organization, argues that today, i.e. 1907, just in the aftermath of the 1905 revolution, that they're arguing for a democratic republic. Now, the Bolsheviks viewed the demand for a democratic republic as being a stepping stone from the feudal reactionary period of the domination of the Tsardom, and it was to be a demand because it enabled the working class to operate more freely in terms of pursuing class struggle. And that is the reason why the Bolsheviks were demanding it. It's not that they had any great belief in the bourgeois democratic republic being able to lead to socialism, which is what the opportunists were arguing. It's that the bourgeois democratic republic offered the most chance to do free agitation amongst the masses, to do more work in trade unions, to publish more newspapers, because as you could tell from what I said earlier about the suppression of the Bolshevik newspaper in Tbilisi after 3 weeks, even after the 1905 revolution, the Tsardom was still very heavy on the censorship. So Stalin's arguing here, like, look, we put forward this demand because it's a stepping stone that allows us greater freedom of operation. It's not because we believe that the bourgeois democratic republic is going to take us anywhere particularly good. It just gives us more freedom to operate, and we need to be educating the working class to that regard as well. Whereas the anarchists were, of course, arguing the same thing they're arguing now, which is smash the state and that's it. And so Stalin's giving a more, they're giving the dialectical analysis here as to why you put forward this demand, why then you try and popularize it amongst the working class, and of course ultimately what you want to see get out of it. So of course Russia did have something of a bourgeois democratic republic in 1917, but of course it proved itself wholly inadequate to the task, and the masses ran towards the Bolshevik party when it became obvious to millions and millions of workers and peasants that the likes of Kerensky and the Mensheviks weren't going to actually do any of the things that they were saying they were going to do. So I'll just read another quote because it's useful to illustrate this. So Stalin says that the Democratic Republic can be both good and bad at the same time, but I'll read the quote to give you the full picture. Today we are demanding a democratic republic. Can we say that the democratic republic is good in all respects or bad in all respects? No, we cannot. Why? Because the democratic republic is good only in one respect, when it destroys the feudal system, but it is bad in another respect, when it strengthens the bourgeois system. Hence we say, insofar as the democratic republic destroys the feudal system, it is good, and we fight for it. But insofar as it strengthens the bourgeois system, it is bad, and we fight against it. So the same democratic republic can be good and bad at the same time. It is yes and no. The same thing may be said about the 8-hour day, which is good and bad at the same time. Good insofar as it strengthens the proletariat, and bad insofar as it strengthens the wages system. And just to give a further example of that from Marx, Marx talks in the book Wages, Price and Profit, which I'm studying with some other comrades at the moment, about how the bills for the 10-hour and then the 8-hour day in Britain actually enabled capitalism to revolutionize itself further by investing in greater, more productive machinery, by we're instituting new work patterns, by hiring more workers, part-time workers, etc. It actually enabled capitalism to engage in a new spurt of growth because it was forced to innovate to try and get around the impact on its profits that the 10-hour and 8-hour day bills were doing. So on the one hand, as Stalin makes the point here, it strengthens the proletariat because the proletariat has attained something through struggle. On the other hand, it ended up strengthening the wages system because it enabled the capitalists to generate even more capital because they were forced to innovate and ultimately ended up benefiting from it. And this is how you need to analyze reforms at any period in time, especially now we're in a period of long-term capitalist decline in the imperialist countries. You need to analyze, well, what is the potential good coming out of this for the class struggle and the proletariat? What is the potential bad side of it coming out of it? And you need to interrogate the demands that you're making and the program that you're putting together to be able to come up with the adequate answers to those questions. But what Stalin's pointing out here is that he and Lenin and the other early Bolshevik leaders were not only acutely aware of how demands that were being put forward in that particular moment were not only limited, but needed to then be overcome themselves when they were attained, so the demand for a democratic republic. But they were doing so in papers that were going out to the masses, to the workers. So this wasn't a debate that was hidden from the working class, that was just being done by the by the Bolsheviks behind closed doors. No, this was something that they were putting out there for the political education of the masses, and going before the masses to explain to them, this is why we put forward the demand for the Democratic Republic. This is why we see it has a certain value, and this is why we see it is limited and something which must be overcome. And so there's a very important thing to bear in mind. The Bolsheviks in this period were not shying away from taking complicated ideas to the masses, to the working class, who were in many cases barely literate or illiterate, but they never underestimated for a moment the working class's ability to actually understand often complicated ideas, because they knew that it was only by explaining, or in Lenin's term, patiently explaining these ideas to the working class, that they were able to actually raise the political consciousness, raise the class consciousness of the working class, to enable them to play a greater role in the class struggle. So it's very important to bear that in mind, that these debates that the Bolsheviks were having weren't something that was just had in committee rooms amongst intellectuals. These were live debates amongst workers' educational circles in Tbilisi, and of course Stalin got one of his big breaks in the party by the fact that he was running a lot of these educational circles. He set them up in the working class districts of Tbilisi, and he had a great deal of success in starting these reading groups amongst workers in the garment factories of Georgia. So he's very much a man who started off politically from the very earliest days, organizing workers, educating workers, getting them to understand the debates that were going on in the party, and trying to raise the level of class consciousness. So the other point I wanted to end on here, because it's approaching the hour mark, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up into either 2 or possibly 3 episodes on this particular book, Anarchism or Socialism. So the other point that he's making here is that when we're talking about revolution doesn't just burst forth out of nothing. To draw on the point I was making about the bourgeois revolutions earlier, Stalin's making the point that no, you can see how revolutions occur. And in the case of capitalism, you can see the productive forces maturing to the point where they become socialized, but also the fact that the productive forces are socialized but the profit is privatized creates the key, or one of the key contradictions of capitalism, which makes revolution an absolute necessity for the working class. And so that takes us to the end of part 1 of the book, chapter 1 of the book. We've got 2 more parts to go, the materialist theory and Stalin's chapter on socialism. So what I'll do is I will do another episode of this on the materialist theory section between 8 and 9 o'clock next week. So I will now answer some questions from those in the chat to look at wrapping this up. Makumi asks, how do you stop the protests that emerge as working class concerns, like in France, being hijacked by the lumpen and others for non-class issues? So the question of, I was talking about it earlier, when you get like lumpenized riots that might come from a legitimate class concern, the key thing is always organization. The key factor is always the presence of the organized working class leading a struggle, or being able to exercise influence over a struggle. At the moment, what you saw was in these suburbs of France, where the lower end working class and the lumpenized elements live, the organized working class does not have a great deal of influence, and the various communist parties that exist in France, as far as I know, don't have a great deal of presence there. And so what you get when you get an outburst of violence and anger from these areas is that you get it being something which is, there's a lot of energy and a lot of anger there, but it's all something which comes with either lumpenized or just straight up bourgeois ideology behind it. The only way around it is, again, to build the power of the organized working class and build the power of a communist party, within the working class, and also to, frankly, go out into these areas where there hasn't been a communist presence for decades and rebuild the presence there and build up cadre-based organization in these places. Because otherwise, the only influence that's going to be there is bourgeois ideology, or the ideology of gangsters, or the ideology of religious organizations. And that is true not just in France, it's true all the way across the advanced capitalist world. The only way that the revolutionary upsurges can be directed in the correct area towards the power of the bourgeoisie, towards the power of the bourgeois state, to ultimately overthrow the ruling class and overthrow their state, is if there is a strong enough working class led by a strong enough vanguard party. That is the only way forward. Any other way around this isn't going to work. Not support for reformist organizations like Mélenchon or the St. Jeremy of Islington. It's to build communist parties in all of the imperialist countries in a way that has not been done for 100 years. It's not been done seriously since the 20s and 30s. After the World War II, you just got a long period of, yes, that these organizations were very big, but they became reformist organizations and just went into decline. So we need to engage in a process that's not been engaged in seriously for many, many decades now. That's the only way through this. Donda172. No idea why this came into my recommended. Because it's good. That's why it came up. Peter says, has the capitalist class decided that there'll be no more pacifying the working class? It'll be all stick, repressive, carceral censorship and class war by deliberately engineered recession. Well, they didn't deliberately need to engineer the recession. They're now looking to make the recession worse in order to justify a full-scale attack on the working class. But at the moment, what they will need to do is that they will need to take enough of the petty bourgeoisie and the upper end of the working class with them in order to thoroughly stick the boot into the overwhelming majority of the working class. So for the most of us, it will be all stick, it'll be all repression, it'll be greater prison populations. Prison population will go through the roof, enhanced policing, more weaponry for the cops, more powers for the cops, more powers also for army units to operate inside the borders of the country and do so openly. And the problem for the bourgeois is that unless they want to just go straight for dictatorship, but even then, even if they go straight for fascism, even fascism needs to cultivate and retain a certain amount of support within the petty bourgeoisie and certain elements of the lumpen as well. So they need to find a way to keep that element tied to them. And it's why fascism ultimately needs a fake revolution like Mussolini's March on Rome, or the fake revolution of the constitution of Hitler's government and everything that they did in their first few days in office. If they just try and go for a simple Bonapartist method of rule with no ability to pull any kind of popular base of support behind them, then that'll create a problem for them. So yes, we're going to get more repression and more simple brute force, but they will also need to make an offer to the petty bourgeoisie and a minority of the working class to enable them to pull this off. If they try and do it without doing that, then they will instantly have a real problem. Because the state, in order to carry out this repression, needs to carry with it enough legitimacy in the minds of the masses to be able to do that. It's why Thatcherism ultimately succeeded. First of all, it was because, of course, that the working class was divided and poorly led, but that they carried enough of the petty bourgeoisie and the labour aristocracy with them to enable them to carry out those attacks and still retain a level of popular support. So, thoughts on the Brand Taibbi censorship industrial complex event? Harmless liberalism or anti-communist propaganda? I haven't watched any of these events, I must be honest. Taibbi's an anti-communist, though. Brand is a confused celebrity. So, and I know that some of the people involved in it, like Schellenberger, are very much vehement anti-communists. So, and the way that this is presented, particularly in the United States and Britain, is that they are sort of shoving together a lot of things and using it as a sort of anti-communist battering ram. So they'll say, well, look at the COVID regime. The left was all in favour of it, which is unfortunately true. that the left wants censorship, which again is unfortunately true. And this means that we've got communism infiltrating and on the rise in our countries, and we need to snuff this out. And what that'll do is try and mobilize elements within the alienated working class and petty bourgeoisie to get on board with what will ultimately be a crackdown on trade unions and working class bargaining power. That's where this sort of anti-communist battering ram is going. That and more censorship in all places where any opposition could pop up, like universities, for instance. So, yeah, it could end up being like an anti-communist propaganda event, and I wouldn't trust Taibbi as far as I could throw him, to be completely honest. As I said, the man's an anti-communist and always has been. So, we're hitting the top of the hour, been going for about an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes now. So what I will do is I will end it there for tonight. I will be back again with more tomorrow. We will be back with more of Stalin this time next week. So if you haven't read Anarchism or Socialism yet, be sure to do so. You can get through it in about a couple of hours over the course of a week. And I would recommend reading it. It's a very interesting book. There's a lot of great explanations of the dialectical method in there. So, be back again tomorrow with, shall we say, a news and current affairs show and sort of another Q&A. So, until then, thank you everybody for watching, listening. The audio version of this will be up on the Patreon page for subscribers. So, until tomorrow, thank you.